Welcome to AI Book Highlights.
Great to be here.
Today we're tackling a book that really stirred the pot in nutrition circles. It's Nina Teicholz's The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
It certainly made waves, yeah. Challenges decades of dietary advice, especially around saturated fat.
Exactly. So forget what you might think you know, because we're going to unpack the core arguments here. We'll look at, the evidence or maybe the lack of it behind a lot of the low-fat guidance we've all heard.
And explore some of the ripple effects, like what happened when people cut out fat, and the surprising story of things like trans fats and vegetable oils.
Right. Our goal is pretty straightforward. Cut through the noise, give you the key insights from the book, and try to make sense of this really complex field.
It is complex, and the book argues, quite forcefully, that some very deeply held beliefs might be built on shaky ground. Teicholz really digs into the history, how we got these recommendations.
And raises some big questions about the science back then.
Definitely. So we'll focus on, say, 5 key highlights where the book offers a different perspective.
Okay. And then boil those down into maybe 3 practical takeaways for you listening.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. So point number 1 the book makes is about the weakness, maybe, of that early nutrition science, particularly around fat.
Yeah, the frailty of it. It argues many recommendations came from observational studies.
Okay, observational studies. For anyone maybe not super familiar, why is that potentially a limitation? What's the issue there?
Well, think of it like this. You watch a group of people, you note what they eat, and you note their health outcomes, say, years later. You might see that people who eat more X seem to have more Y.
Yeah, seems logical.
But the problem is, you can't be sure X caused Y. Maybe people who eat more X also smoke more, or exercise less, or have different genetics, or 100 other things. It's incredibly hard to isolate just one part of the diet.
Right. Life is messy. Diets are messy.
Exactly. And the book argues that in the real push to fight heart disease back then, researchers leaned heavily on this kind of data, which isn't ideal for proving cause and effect, and that might have skewed the conclusions.
And it wasn't like everyone agreed even then, was it? The book mentions scientists who questioned the whole low-fat idea.
Oh, yeah. Respected scientists, too. But they faced significant opposition.
Why was it so hard to challenge it, do you think, once an idea gets out there?
Well, it's partly human nature, isn't it? And partly how science funding and publication often work. Once a major health organization puts out a guideline, it gains momentum.
It becomes the accepted wisdom.
Right. And research funding might flow towards confirming it, not challenging it. Challenging the status quo can be tough professionally. Teicholz gives some pretty compelling examples of researchers who raised flags but really struggled to get heard.
Okay, now let's shift to the real-world impact. This is where it gets pretty stark. The book links the American Heart Association's 1961 low-fat recommendation to what happened next with obesity rates.
It does. It points out that after that recommendation, and as low-fat eating became more widespread over the next few decades, obesity rates didn't go down. They went up significantly.
That seems completely counterintuitive. Cut the fat, get fatter.
Well, correlation isn't causation. We always have to say that. But the book builds a case that maybe this drastic dietary shift had unintended consequences.
Like what happens when you just slash fat?
People tend to replace those calories with something else, often carbohydrates, and, not always the healthy high-fiber kind. Think refined grains, sugars, low-fat snacks that are packed with carbs.
Ah, okay. So the type of replacement matters.
Immensely.
Yeah.
It affects your blood sugar, insulin levels, feelings of fullness,
Right.
potentially leading to weight gain over time. The book points out that by the mid-90s, the official goal was just to get obesity back to 1960 levels.
And they couldn't even do that.
Nope. That goal proved unreachable, and diabetes rates climbed alongside obesity. It suggests this maybe wasn't the magic bullet people hoped for.
What's really wild to me is that this huge national recommendation, low fat for everyone, was basically policy for 30 years. Before they did a massive, proper scientific trial like the Women's Health Initiative in the 90s to actually test it rigorously. That seems completely backwards.
It does underscore the point about the early evidence, doesn't it? A major public health directive promoted for decades without the gold standard evidence we'd ideally want.
Yeah, it makes you think about how we make these big decisions.
Absolutely. What level of proof do we need before telling millions of people to change how they eat?
All right, let's get to the core of the surprise then. Saturated fat. Butter, meat, eggs, cheese. The stuff we were told for ages was terrible for our hearts. The book says that fear was never based on solid science.
That's the central claim. Teicholz goes back to the original studies,
Yeah.
the ones that supposedly link saturated fat directly to heart disease, and she argues they were flawed.
Flawed.
Well, several ways. Sometimes they lumped saturated fats in with trans fats, which we now know are definitely harmful.
Yeah.
So they weren't isolating the effect of saturated fat alone.
Okay, that's a big confounder.
Huge. Also, a lot of early research focused on things like blood cholesterol levels, specifically LDL, as sort of a proxy for heart disease risk.
All right, the bad cholesterol.
But just changing cholesterol doesn't always translate directly to fewer heart attacks or deaths.
Yeah.
You need to look at the actual heart outcomes. The book argues the evidence linking saturated fat itself directly to those heart outcomes was inconsistent and much weaker than we were led to believe. An early bias just got locked in.
And the book brings up examples that seem to contradict the theory, right? Like that explorer, Stephens.
Gilmore Stephenson, yeah. He was an Arctic explorer who, back in the 1920s, lived for a whole year under scientific observation, eating only meat and animal fat. Mostly fat, actually.
Just meat and fat.
For a year.
And what happened?
He remained perfectly healthy. Now, it's an anecdote, just one person, but it definitely challenges the idea that a diet high in animal fat is automatically deadly.
Interesting.
The book also mentions populations like the Maasai in Africa, whose traditional diets were very rich in milk, meat, and blood, lots of animal fat. Yet they historically had low rates of heart disease.
So these real-world examples don't quite fit the simple saturated fat is bad narrative.
They certainly complicate it. It suggests the relationship between these fats and our health is probably much more nuanced.
Okay, this next highlight is, well, it's quite the twist. Because we were so scared of saturated fat, the alternative pushed by health advocates in the food industry involved hydrogenated vegetable oils.
Which meant trans fats. Loads of them.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? Trying to avoid one thing, we ended up promoting something potentially worse.
It's a really stark example of unintended consequences. The intention, reduced saturated fat, seemed good, but the replacement, driven by this fear, turned out to be a major problem.
And groups we think of as consumer watchdogs were actually promoting these oils.
Yes. The book points specifically to groups like the Center for Science in the Public Interest, CSPI, who campaigned against things like beef tallow and coconut oil and actively promoted processed vegetable oils.
Wow.
Many of those oils were then hydrogenated to make them solid and shelf-stable, perfect for processed foods and frying.
And did scientists realize the danger of these trans fats early on?
There were researchers, like Fred Kummerow, is mentioned prominently, who raised concerns quite early. They saw troubling effects in animal studies and started questioning the health impact on humans.
But the industry didn't exactly jump to change things.
No. The book details how the edible oil industry kind of pushed back. They funded their own research, questioned the negative findings. It took a long time, a lot of accumulating evidence, and public pressure before regulations finally started forcing trans fats out of the food supply.
It really shows that complex web, doesn't it? Science, public health messages, industry interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the push to get rid of trans fats then left the industry scrambling for replacements, sometimes leading back to oils high in saturated fat or other types of vegetable oils that might have their own issues. It's a complicated saga.
Okay, final highlight. Let's talk about the Mediterranean diet. It's always held up as the gold standard, right? Healthy, delicious.
It generally is seen that way, yes. Lots of vegetables, fish, olive oil.
But the book suggests maybe the picture, especially the role of olive oil, isn't quite as clear-cut as we think.
Exactly. While the overall pattern seems healthy, Teicholz argues that the specific evidence proving olive oil itself is the key driver of heart benefits is, well, less robust than often claimed.
Really? Olive oil is always the star.
It is, but historically, in many parts of the Mediterranean, other fats were actually more common for cooking, like lard.
Lard, huh?
Yeah. Also, defining the Mediterranean diet for research is tricky. Is it Greek, Italian, Spanish? They vary, so comparing studies can be difficult.
And some of the studies supporting it had weaknesses.
The book points to some methodological limitations in certain key studies that promoted the diet. It's not saying the diet is unhealthy, but maybe the reasons for its benefits are more complex than just eat lots of olive oil.
And interestingly, the book mentions that sometimes when compared directly, low-carb, higher-fat diets actually performed as well or even better than the Mediterranean diet in some studies.
Right, particularly for things like weight loss or improving certain metabolic markers like blood sugar control.
So it again suggests there isn't just one single right way to eat.
That seems to be a key underlying message. Focusing on whole, unprocessed foods seems important, but the specific mix of fats and carbs might be more flexible than we thought. Different patterns can lead to good health.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, challenging some big ideas. Let's try to distill this into some actionable takeaways for people listening. What's the first one?
I think the biggest one is be critical of widely accepted dietary advice.
Don't just take it as gospel because it's been around a long time.
Exactly. Recognize that nutrition science evolves. It's complex. What seemed true based on early, maybe limited evidence might get overturned later.
Like the whole low-fat saga we discussed.
Precisely. That history and the trans fat episode, they're cautionary tales. They show how even well-intentioned advice, based on the science of the time, can have unforeseen negative impacts. So, questioning, looking at newer evidence, it's healthy.
Okay, makes sense. Takeaway number 2.
This follows on from the trans fat story especially. Consider the source and funding of nutrition research.
Be aware of who's paying for the studies.
Yeah. The book gives examples, like the edible oil industry defending trans fats. Industry funding doesn't automatically mean research is bad, but it can introduce bias, consciously or unconsciously.
In how studies are designed or interpreted or even published.
All of the above. So try to look for research from independent sources if you can. Be a bit skeptical if a study seems to perfectly align with the financial interests of its funder. It's just about adding context.
Right, critically evaluating the information. Good advice. And the third takeaway.
It's really about zooming out. Focus on whole foods, and maybe consider traditional dietary patterns.
So less focus on single nutrients like just fat or just carbs, and more on the overall quality.
I think so. The book implicitly suggests that maybe our bodies do well with diets containing natural fats, including from animal sources, as part of a diet rich in whole, unprocessed foods.
Like diets people ate before highly processed foods took over.
Kinda, yeah. Think about dietary patterns that have sustained populations healthily for generations, whether they were higher in fat or higher in carbs, but were based on real food. The emphasis should probably be on nutrient density and minimal processing, rather than getting caught up in the latest diet war based on potentially flawed science.
So be critical, check the source, and focus on whole foods. That seems like solid advice regardless of where you land on the fat debate.
Pretty much. It's about navigating the confusing world of nutrition with a bit more awareness.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look into the big fat surprise. It definitely challenges you to think differently about dietary fat and the history of nutritional advice. Thanks for walking us through it.
My pleasure. It's a book that sparks a lot of important discussion.
Absolutely. So if you listening want to dive much deeper into the arguments, the studies, the whole detailed history.
We definitely recommend picking up a copy of the book itself, The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz.
Yeah, it's densely researched. You can find a link to purchase it right there in the description below. Thanks for joining us today on AI Book Highlights.